Welcome back to Sip and Talk. I'm Joe.
Hey everyone, and I'm Sunny.
Ready to dive in. Grab your favorite beverage.
Absolutely. Though, fair warning, today's discussion, it's a bit heavy. We're looking at some history, specifically recent Chinese history, that maybe isn't always well understood, especially here in the U.S.
That's putting it mildly. Yeah, get this. Over 70 years ago, Tibet signed a peace agreement. Sounds great, right? Peace. Wonderful.
It sounds wonderful, but the reality, within just a few years, the Dalai Lama was in exile. Ancient monasteries were being destroyed.
And hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives. It's stark.
So what actually happened there? And, this isn't just an isolated incident. We see echoes, different versions maybe, of this pattern playing out elsewhere, like Mongolia and Hong Kong.
Right. Mongolia managed to gain independence, but that had a lot to do with, external factors. Big ones.
Namely, the Soviet Union really propping them up, needed that buffer state.
Exactly. And then there's Hong Kong. One country, two systems. That was the promise. But now it feels much more like one country, one voice. The timeline got significantly shorter than promised. And look, this isn't just some dry history lesson we're digging up. The reason we're talking about this is because it could potentially be the playbook Taiwan might face down the line.
That's the core concern. Every action, every framework that gets packaged with words like peace or unification, well, history suggests there are massive risks hidden inside.
Risks like what? We're talking about potential cultural erasure, the complete dismantling of existing institutions, and honestly, just resetting what basic freedoms even mean.
So today on Sip and Talk, we're exploring when history repeats itself, Tibet, Hong Kong, and the warning for Taiwan.
And our mission really is to unpack these historical examples. What can Tibet, Mongolia, and Hong Kong tell us about the future? And maybe more importantly, how do these huge geopolitical shifts actually connect back to your life, your freedoms?
It's about understanding the patterns because, understanding the past is often key to navigating the present and the future.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning with the historical prototype, you could say, Tibet. Yeah. And just how fragile that 17-point agreement from 1951 turned out to be.
Right. To really get it, you need the context. The agreement was signed on May 23, 1951. But this wasn't some friendly chat over tea.
No, not at all.
It came right after a pretty significant military action. The People's Liberation Army, the PLA, had invaded eastern Tibet, the Chamdo area, back in October 1950.
And that wasn't a minor skirmish. There were thousands of casualties on the Tibetan side.
Exactly. So the agreement was signed after that military defeat, which kind of puts the peaceful part in a different light, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really undercuts the whole idea of it being voluntary. It sounds much more like signing under duress.
That's precisely how the Tibetan government of exile describes it, even today. They say it was signed under the barrel of a gun. It wasn't a negotiation between equals.
Okay, so what did this agreement on measures for the peaceful liberation of Tibet, actually promise on paper? Because the name sounds like liberation, like help.
Well, on paper, it had some key points. Tibet acknowledged Chinese sovereignty, yes, but crucially, it seemed to guarantee a lot of existing structures.
Like what specifically?
Things like retaining the status and function of the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama, the key spiritual leaders. And it explicitly promised protection for religious freedom, for monasteries, for local customs.
Okay, those sound like pretty solid protections.
Yeah.
But you mentioned a core guarantee earlier. What about internal governance?
Ah, yes, that's the absolute linchpin. The agreement literally stated in writing, no forced reform.
No forced reforms, meaning
any changes to Tibet's social structure, land system, anything like that, were supposed to be carried out voluntarily by the local Tibetan government itself. It was a written promise of non-interference in their internal affairs.
A promise of autonomy, basically. So Tibet runs Tibet. China handles the external stuff. That was the deal on paper.
That was the deal on paper. Recognizing their unique traditions, their leadership, it all sounded quite reasonable if you just read the text.
So the $1 million question. How long did this seemingly reasonable, voluntary, non-interfering agreement actually hold up? When did the cracks start to show?
Immediately. The ink was barely dry. By 1951, the same year it was signed, the PLA entered Lhasa, the capital.
Okay. Troops moving in. That doesn't sound very autonomous.
Not really. And they established a military administrative committee. So right away, despite the promise of autonomy on paper, you have a central military and administrative body essentially taking control on the ground.
So the written guarantees for self-governance were Well, pretty much a compromise from day one if there's an external military administration calling the shots.
Exactly. The reality on the ground quickly diverged from the text of the agreement.
And the resistance, the pushback against these changes. It didn't happen everywhere all at once, did it?
No, that's a really important point. The major armed resistance really kicked off around 1956, and it was concentrated initially in the eastern regions, Kham and Amdo.
Why there first?
These areas were culturally Tibetan, definitely, but historically they'd been governed a bit differently, sometimes more directly under Chinese administration, depending on the era. Beijing started implementing land reform and, crucially, interfering with religious practices there much earlier and more forcefully.
Which directly violated the no-force reform clause of the 51 agreement.
Directly, unequivocally. So when the local populations in Kham and Amdo resisted these forced changes to their land and their religion, well, the response was harsh.
How harsh are we talking?
Brutal suppression by the PLA. Hundreds of monasteries in those eastern regions were destroyed between 56 and 59. This wasn't just political control, it was cultural destruction, too.
And this escalating violence, this cycle of forced reform, resistance, and suppression, that led eventually to the big breaking point, right? 1959.
Yes, the Lhasa uprising. That's the watershed moment. In March 1959, there were widespread fears and rumors in Lhasa that the Chinese military was plotting to kidnap the Dalai Lama.
Kidnap him? Wow.
Yeah. And that fear sparked this massive, spontaneous, popular uprising. Thousands of ordinary Tibetans poured into the streets to protect their leader, surrounding his palace, the Norbalinka.
And the outcome?
It ended tragically. The PLA crushed the uprising violently. Days later, on March 17, 1959, the Dalai Lama, fearing for his life and the future of his people, had to flee under the cover of darkness.
That's when his exile began.
Yes. He escaped to India, followed by about 80,000 other Tibetan refugees in that initial wave. And importantly, once he reached safety in India, he publicly repudiated the 17-point agreement.
He basically said, this thing was signed under duress, they violated every single point, it's null and void.
Precisely. He confirmed the conditions under which it was signed and detailed the breaches. But the human cost. It didn't stop with the uprising or the initial flight of refugees. It got much, much worse.
Yeah, you mentioned the death toll earlier. Estimates are staggering. The Tibetan government in exile suggests over 1.2 million deaths between 1950 and 1979. Where do those numbers come from? It wasn't all direct fighting, was it?
No, not at all. A huge, devastating portion of that toll came from the imposition of mainland Chinese policies onto Tibet, specifically the Great Leap Forward.
Okay, we need to unpack that connection. The Great Leap Forward wasn't designed for Tibet, was it? How did applying it there lead to such catastrophe?
It was disastrously unsuited for the Tibetan plateau. It meant forced agricultural collectivization, taking land away from traditional farming structures. And worse, the central government mandated what to plant and how to farm, pushing methods totally inappropriate for the high altitude, the thin soil, the specific climate.
So political ideology overriding centuries of local agricultural knowledge.
Exactly. The result was predictable and horrific. Widespread crop failures leading to famine and mass starvation across the plateau. This was compounded by the violence of forced labor in camps and the general suppression.
So the peaceful liberation led not just to military occupation, but to famine caused by imposing unsuitable political economic systems.
Yes. The death toll wasn't just bullets. It was starvation, it was disease in labor camps, it was the complete breakdown of the society's ability to sustain itself under these imposed policies.
And the cultural destruction continued even after the initial uprising and famine period.
Oh, absolutely. During the Cultural Revolution from roughly 1966 to 1976, the assault on Tibetan culture intensified. Ancient monasteries, libraries, religious artifacts, centuries of heritage were systematically destroyed. Estimates suggest something like 95% of monasteries were wiped out.
95%, just gone. So much for the protection of religious freedom promised in the agreement.
Completely annihilated. So if you boil down the Tibetan experience, what's the core lesson about these kinds of agreements?
It seems pretty clear. A written promise of autonomy or peace, no matter how nicely worded, means almost nothing if the stronger party has established unchallenged military and administrative control on the ground.
That's the crux of it. Once the power dynamic is that skewed, once the boots are on the ground, the written word becomes flexible, optional even.
And the initial justification, often framed around history or liberation, that gets replaced by new justifications like stability or reform once control is cemented.
Precisely. The agreement serves its purpose to legitimize the initial entry, perhaps, but it offers no real protection once that entry is achieved. Okay, so now let's jump forward, decades forward. Let's look at Hong Kong, because this is the modern example, and it shows how this process of eroding autonomy can happen much, much faster. Terrifyingly faster, really.
Right. One country, two systems. OCTT. That was the framework, the big promise made back in the 80s leading up to the 1997 handover from Britain.
It was pitched as this ingenious solution, wasn't it? Hong Kong, Macau, and the idea was implicitly extended towards Taiwan, too, could keep their existing systems.
Keep your capitalism, keep your independent courts, the common law system, totally different from the mainland, keep a high degree of autonomy for 50 years until 2047.
The central government in Beijing would only handle defense and foreign affairs. Everything else, economy, law, administration, lifestyle, would stay local.
It sounded like a pretty good deal, honestly. Like, you keep your successful shop running exactly as it is. You just have a new landlord handling the building security outside. Good for global business, good for confidence.
And, for a couple of decades, it seemed to function, more or less. There were definitely points of friction, controversies over interpretations of the basic law, protests. But the fundamental structure seemed to hold.
There was always a catch, right? A kind of escape clause built into the foundation.
There was. The fatal flaw, you could argue. The central government always retained the ultimate authority. Specifically, it reserved the right to interpret the basic law and, crucially, to intervene directly in Hong Kong affairs if it deemed matters of national security, sovereignty, or stability were threatened.
That phrase, national security, that seems to be the key that unlocks the intervention.
It absolutely is. And that vaguely defined power held in reserve was eventually used to dismantle the two systems part of the equation.
And the speed of it in Hong Kong is what's truly breathtaking compared to the slow, grinding process in Tibet over years.
It's night and day. What took decades in Tibet essentially happened in Hong Kong within months. The major turning point, the moment everything changed, was the imposition of the National Security Law, the NSL, in June 2020.
Imposition being the key word.
Yeah.
This wasn't passed by Hong Kong's own legislature, was it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Beijing drafted it and imposed it directly, completely bypassing Hong Kong's legislative process. That action itself was a stark demonstration of central power overriding the promised local autonomy. It basically inserted mainland legal concepts and enforcement mechanisms directly into Hong Kong.
And it wasn't just that one law. They followed it up locally, too.
They did. Fairly quickly, in 2024, Hong Kong's own legislature passed the local version, often called the Article 23 legislation. This law worked in tandem with the Beijing-imposed NSL.
What did these laws actually do?
Together, they dramatically broadened the definitions of crimes like secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces. The language was vague, allowing for wide interpretation. They effectively gave the authorities sweeping powers to crack down on dissent, political speech, protests, even critical journalism or academic work.
So critics would say these laws basically just overrode the guarantees that were supposed to be protected under the basic law, ending the two systems' distinction in practice.
That's the widespread view, yes, that the legal firewall between Hong Kong and the mainland system was effectively breached and dismantled by these security laws.
And politically, alongside the legal changes, we started hearing this new phrase constantly: patriots governing Hong Kong. What did that mean on the ground?
It meant the end of any meaningful democratic opposition within the formal political system. Beijing implemented sweeping electoral reforms.
Reforms how?
They drastically reduced the number of directly elected seats in the legislature. And more importantly, they created a vetting committee. Only candidates deemed patriots, meaning loyal to Beijing, politically compliant, could even run for office.
So you couldn't even get on the ballot if you held views critical of the central government?
Essentially, no. It ensured that the legislature, the Chief Executive Election Committee, all key bodies were filled only with individuals approved by Beijing. It effectively eliminated any organized democratic opposition from holding power or even having a significant voice within the government structure.
Okay, let's connect this legal and political overhaul to the real world.
Yeah.
What were the immediate consequences, this reedification, as some call it? You could see it happening, right?
Oh, absolutely. The impact on civil society was immediate and profound. The space for free expression just shrank dramatically.
Like with the media.
Yeah, that was very visible. Independent news outlets that were critical of the government, like the popular newspaper Apple Daily or Stand News, were forced to close. Their executives were arrested under the NSL.
And arrests weren't limited to media figures.
Not at all. The crackdown was broad. Between 2020 and roughly mid-2025, reports indicate over 330 individuals were arrested under the NSL or related sedition charges.
For things that wouldn't have been crimes before 2020.
Exactly. We're talking about pro-democracy, politicians, activists, trade unionists, lawyers, social workers, academics, even ordinary citizens arrested for things like chanting slogans, organizing informal election primaries, or possessing children's books deemed seditious. Nonviolent actions suddenly became serious national security offenses.
And this rapid political change, this chilling effect, it caused people to leave, didn't it? A pretty significant exodus.
Huge. Historic, really. Since the protests started heating up in 2019, and especially after the NSL in 2020, Hong Kong has seen a massive wave of emigration. Estimates suggest over 500,000 residents have left.
500,000 people voting with their feet. Where did they go?
Many went to the UK, taking advantage of the British National Overseas, or BNO, visa scheme. The UK government opened this path specifically for Hong Kongers born before 1997 and their dependents, offering a route to residency and citizenship.
And the numbers showed people took it.
Over 322,000 applications for that BNO scheme alone. That's a staggering number. And it clearly demonstrates this wasn't just normal migration, it was a political flight directly linked to the perceived loss of freedoms and the breakdown of the one country, two systems promise. Canada and Australia also saw significant numbers.
It's not just losing people, though. This kind of brain drain must have a big economic impact, too.
Definitely. You're losing experienced professionals, entrepreneurs, highly skilled workers. There are also estimates of significant capital flight, maybe around $76 billion or more as people move their assets out. Hong Kong's identity is shifting rapidly.
From a unique, globally connected financial hub with its own system,
to a city whose political culture, legal environment, and ultimately economic future are becoming much more tightly integrated with and subordinate to the mainland's framework. The distinctiveness is fading fast.
So if Tibet showed us how a peace deal backed by military force is fragile over the long term,
Hong Kong showed us two alarming things for the modern era. First, that a promised 50-year guarantee can be effectively canceled much, much sooner. The timeline is not sacred.
And second?
Second, that the method of dismantling autonomy has evolved. It doesn't necessarily require years of overt military occupation and famine like in Tibet. It can be done relatively quickly, bloodlessly even, through sophisticated legal and political maneuvers centered on the concept of national security. That's the modern playbook.
It really paints a stark picture of how autonomy, even when guaranteed on paper, can erode. Okay, let's widen the lens for a moment. Geopolitically, when we talk about China's view of its territory, often framed as historically indivisible, there's an obvious question, isn't there?
You mean Mongolia?
Exactly. Outer Mongolia. Why is it an independent country today if the principle is reunification of all historically claimed territories? It seems like a major exception.
It is a major exception, and understanding why is crucial. Mongolia's independence, formally recognized by China in 1945 and 1946, wasn't achieved through internal negotiation or because of some special historical status.
It was external power, right?
Entirely. It was due to the massive, undeniable military and political backing of the Soviet Union. Stalin basically forced the issue during the negotiations around the end of World War II and the post-war settlement in Asia.
Why did the Soviets care so much?
Geopolitics. They needed Mongolia as a stable, friendly buffer state separating them from China and, earlier, from Japanese influence in Manchuria. An independent Soviet-aligned Mongolia served Moscow's strategic interests perfectly.
So the lesson from Mongolia isn't about the strength of its own claims, but about the power of external protection.
Precisely. It demonstrates that territorial status, especially around China's periphery, has often been decided less by historical documents or internal desires, and more by raw geopolitical power dynamics, and the presence or absence of a strong external protector, particularly during times when central Chinese authority was weaker, like after the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911.
Remove the external protector, and the historical claim tends to reemerge.
That seems to be the pattern. And that brings us closer to home, geographically speaking, when we think about other regions, like Xinjiang.
Right, Xinjiang. We have to touch on this because it represents, in many ways, the contemporary extreme of state control being implemented under that same banner of national security and stability.
The situation in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region is deeply concerning and has drawn significant international attention. Numerous credible reports from the UN, human rights organizations, investigative journalists, and academic researchers have documented widespread and systematic human rights abuses targeting Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim groups, particularly since around 2017.
And this goes way beyond just political suppression, doesn't it? We're talking about mass detentions.
Yes. The most prominent feature has been the establishment of a vast network of facilities officially called vocational skills, education, and training centers, but widely referred to internationally as re-education camps, or, frankly, concentration camps. Estimates suggest hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million people have been detained in these camps.
Alongside mass surveillance, forced labor.
Exactly. Intense surveillance using cutting-edge technology, restrictions on religious practices, forced sterilizations, cultural destruction, and large-scale programs transferring Uyghurs to work in factories elsewhere in China, often under coercive conditions. The stated goals are counterterrorism, de-extremification, and poverty alleviation. But the documented reality points towards forced assimilation and the crushing of a distinct cultural and ethnic identity.
Now, this isn't just a distant human rights issue, though it's profoundly that. It actually connects directly to the global economy, to things you might buy.
It absolutely does. This is a major economic warning sign as well. The forced labor documented in Xinjiang is deeply integrated into global supply chains.
Especially in certain sectors, right?
Yes, particularly cotton. Xinjiang produces something like 20% of the world's cotton and a huge portion of China's total cotton output. There's a very high risk that apparel you buy could be tainted by forced labor originating there.
It's not just cotton.
No, it also affects critical technology inputs, like polysilicon used for solar panels. Xinjiang is a dominant global producer and other minerals used in electronics. It's pervasive.
This forced labor connection actually led to significant action from the U.S. government, didn't it?
It did. The U.S. passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the UFLPA. This is a really interesting piece of legislation because of how it works.
How does it work?
It establishes what's called a rebuttable presumption. Basically, it presumes that any goods manufactured wholly or in part in Xinjiang are made with forced labor and therefore banned from import into the U.S.
So the burden of proof is flipped.
Exactly. It's not up to U.S. Customs to prove forced labor was used. Instead, the importer, the company trying to bring the goods in, has to provide clear and convincing evidence that their specific products were not made with forced labor.
That sounds incredibly difficult to prove, given the lack of transparency there.
It is extremely difficult, and the impact has been significant. Since the UFLPA went into effect, U.S. Customs has detained or seized billions of dollars worth of goods. I think the figure was over $3.7 billion recently across various sectors. It's forcing companies globally to try and map their supply chains and decouple from Xinjiang, which is complex and costly.
So what's the takeaway from Xinjiang for our discussion today, connecting it back to the listener?
It's a stark warning about the potential extent of state control when national security becomes the overriding justification for everything. If a system can categorize an entire ethnic group, monitor their movements, dictate their labor, and attempt to erase their culture for state goals,
then it certainly has the power to dictate the news you read, the websites you can visit, the opinions you're allowed to express, or even whether you get to keep your job or travel freely.
Precisely. It shows the potential endpoint of unchecked centralized control justified by security concerns. And that chilling reality brings us right to the heart of why we're having this conversation today. It's about taking these historical patterns, Tibet's slow erosion under military occupation, Hong Kong's rapid legal dismantling, Xinjiang's total control model, and asking, what might this mean for Taiwan? What are the concrete risks?
Okay, so let's game out some potential scenarios. These aren't predictions, obviously. Nobody has a crystal ball. But based on the precedents we've discussed, what could integration look like? Let's say scenario A, the Hong Kong fade.
Right. In this scenario, Taiwan might initially get some form of autonomy agreement, maybe even framed more favorably than Hong Kong's basic law on paper. But the pattern suggests Beijing would quickly use national security, anti-secession, or similar justifications to gain control over key levers of power.
Like vetting who gets to be in charge.
Exactly. Vetting high officials, legislative candidates, judges, ensuring only those deemed loyal and compliant can hold positions of influence. At the same time, you'd likely see a gradual tightening of laws around political speech, assembly, and the media criminalizing dissent.
So not necessarily tanks in the streets, but a slow, methodical takeover of the institutions from within, hollowing out democracy.
Pretty much. It's institutional capture. Existing political parties might be sidelined or effectively banned if they don't toe the line. Education curricula would likely be revised to promote unification narratives. Civil society space shrinks dramatically. It might look autonomous on the surface for a while, but the substance is gone. And yes, this could involve targeted arrests or forced exile for prominent opposition figures.
Okay, that's one model. What about scenario B, the gray zone squeeze? This one feels like it might already be happening to some extent.
It does. This scenario avoids a full-scale military invasion, which would be incredibly costly and risky for everyone. Instead, it focuses on using persistent, sub-threshold coercion to wear down Taiwan's political will and economy.
What kinds of coercion are we talking about?
Constant military pressure, frequent air and naval incursions near Taiwan's territory, maybe temporary blockades presented as exercises, economic coercion targeting specific Taiwanese industries or companies with sanctions or boycotts, cyber attacks disrupting critical infrastructure, and massive disinformation campaigns aimed at sowing division within Taiwanese society, undermining trust in democratic institutions, and promoting the idea that resistance is futile.
The goal being?
The goal is to make life increasingly difficult, isolated, and uncertain for Taiwan, hoping to eventually force its government and people to accept some form of political accommodation or unification on Beijing's terms without needing a major war. It's about creating a sense of inevitability.
Right, and then there's the most drastic scenario, scenario C, the Tibet repeat. Outright military conquest.
This is the worst-case scenario, obviously, a full-scale invasion attempt. If successful, it would likely be followed by a period of direct military occupation, similar to post-1959 Tibet, but adapted for Taiwan's context.
What would that look like?
You'd expect martial law, mass arrests of political figures, military personnel, activists, maybe anyone associated with the previous government or pro-independence movements. Dissolution of existing democratic institutions. Forced social and political transformation, potentially including ideological re-education campaigns.
And the human cost.
Given Taiwan's population density, its own significant military capabilities, and the likelihood of intense urban warfare, the human cost of such a scenario would be catastrophic. Casualty estimates vary wildly, but they often run into the hundreds of thousands, potentially much higher when you factor in the initial conflict, subsequent suppression, and the potential for long-term disruption and hardship.
Okay, those scenarios cover the big picture risks, safety, political freedom.
Right.
But let's bring it down to a really personal level, especially for younger people thinking about their future. Let's talk about the Golden Rice Bowl risk, the TSMC factor.
Yes. TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. It's impossible to overstate its importance. This isn't just Taiwan's most valuable company. It's arguably the most strategically important company in the world right now.
Why? Because they make the chips for everything.
They make the most advanced chips for pretty much everything. We're talking about the cutting-edge semiconductors, 5 nanometer, 3 nanometer, heading towards 2 nanometer that power smartphones, AI data centers, advanced computing, modern military hardware. TSMC reportedly controls something like 90% of the global manufacturing capacity for these most advanced chips.
90%? That's insane leverage.
It's Taiwan's silicon shield, its greatest economic asset and geopolitical leverage point. But it also makes it a huge strategic target.
And the company itself knows this, right? TSMC leadership has spoken about what would happen in a conflict scenario.
They have. Former Chairman Mark Liu, for instance, publicly stated quite clearly that if Taiwan were taken by force, TSMC's sophisticated factories would become non-operable.
Non-operable? Why? Couldn't an occupying force just take them over and run them?
It's really not that simple. These factories are incredibly complex ecosystems. They rely on a constant, real-time connection to a global network of suppliers, equipment manufacturers, software providers, and customers. And crucially, they depend on highly specialized equipment.
Like those EUV machines.
Exactly. Extreme ultraviolet lithography machines made almost exclusively by ASML in the Netherlands. These machines themselves contain critical components and software sourced from the US and Japan. If Taiwan were invaded, the US, Netherlands, Japan, and other allies would almost certainly impose immediate and severe sanctions.
Cutting off access to
the machines themselves, spare parts, maintenance, critical software updates, specialized chemicals, everything needed to run those fabs. Plus, they'd cut off access to the major international customers like Apple, NVIDIA, AMD, Qualcomm. The factory might physically exist, but it would be technologically isolated and unable to produce advanced chips for the global market. It becomes a very expensive, useless building.
Okay, so connect that to the individual.
Yeah.
If you're a talented young engineer, working at TSMC, or hoping to. What does this mean for your career if unification happens, especially under coercion or force?
It's devastating for your career prospects. Right now, your skills are globally in demand, commanding high salaries and offering international opportunities. If TSMC is effectively nationalized or cut off from the global ecosystem,
your expertise becomes less valuable.
Dramatically less valuable internationally. You'd be limited to working within the Chinese domestic market, which lacks access to the most advanced global tools and clients. Your international career path essentially evaporates overnight. Your global market value collapses.
And could it get worse? Could you be, forced to work on specific projects?
That's a real risk, drawing parallels from other situations. High-tech talent, especially in a critical field like semiconductors, could easily be classified by the state as national strategic resources, meaning potential restrictions on your freedom. Strict limitations on travel, maybe you can't accept that job offer in Silicon Valley or Europe. Forced transfers to work on state-mandated projects, perhaps military or surveillance-related. Regardless of your personal interests or ethics, your career choices are no longer your own.
So the loss of political freedom directly translates into a loss of personal economic freedom and career mobility. It's not abstract.
Not at all. And it extends beyond just high-tech jobs. Think about basic personal freedoms that young people value, like travel.
Right. A Taiwan passport currently gets you visa-free access to, around 146 countries?
Something like that, a PRC passport. It's significantly fewer, maybe around 78 last I checked. So unification, especially under a less democratic framework, could mean suddenly needing visas for places you used to visit freely. Your dream of backpacking through Europe or studying in the U.S. might get a lot more complicated, maybe even impossible if geopolitical tensions rise.
And what about online? Digital freedom, creative expression, that's huge for younger generations.
Absolutely critical. If Taiwan's open internet and relatively free media environment were replaced by the mainland system, you'd see the Great Firewall descend. State censorship would become the norm.
Meaning?
Meaning restricted access to global websites and social media platforms. Your social media posts, your AI-generated art, even your online comments could be monitored and censored. Independent news sources would disappear, replaced by state-controlled media. Forget posting satirical memes critical of the government that could land you in serious trouble.
Even things like local music or art could be affected.
For sure. Local bands, artists, filmmakers might suddenly need approval from central propaganda departments before releasing their work. Anything deemed politically sensitive or not promoting the official narrative could be suppressed. The vibrant, sometimes critical, often quirky creative culture could be stifled.
So it all comes back to that core warning, doesn't it? The lesson from Tibet, from Hong Kong, applied to the future.
Yeah. It sounds cliche, maybe, but the historical pattern seems to teach that the ultimate cost of not being interested in politics or feeling powerless against these big voices is eventually losing the freedom to choose what you can be interested in. Losing control over your own life path, your job, your travel, your digital world, your culture.
Wow. Okay, that was a lot to cover. An intense, but I think really necessary look to these historical precedents. The pattern, when you lay it out like this, across Tibet, Hong Kong, even looking at Xinjiang, seems depressingly clear, doesn't it?
It really does. A promise of peace, a guarantee of autonomy. It just doesn't seem to hold up long term when it's backed by overwhelming military and administrative power. Especially when that power can just unilaterally rewrite the rules using concepts like national security.
And the evolution of the tactics? That's what's also striking. What took years of grinding military occupation and imposed hardship in Tibet could be achieved much faster in Hong Kong through legal and political means. The speed of change is accelerating. That speed factor is maybe the most chilling part for today. So the point isn't to fearmonger, but to really look at these historical facts objectively, and crucially, connect them to the real-world consequences. We're talking about job security, the future of entire industries like semiconductors, the value of your passport, your ability to speak freely online. It's personal.
Exactly. And remember, our goal here on Sip and Talk is always to present information, to lay out different perspectives based on historical events and current analyses, so you can think critically. We're not here to criticize or discriminate against any country or group of people.
Absolutely not.
We're providing information to foster that critical thinking. That's always the main goal. Understanding the stakes, understanding the patterns.
Well said. All right, that is pretty much all the time we have for this particular deep dive. It was heavy, but hopefully useful. Make sure you subscribe to Sip and Talk wherever you get your podcasts.
Yes, please do. And hey, also give a shout out to our old friend Micky over on his YouTube channel, Micky to Life.
Oh, yeah, Micky. He's always got some fun stuff, travel vlogs, sometimes some interesting liquor tastings, maybe some memes.
He does, though, speaking of Micky, bless his heart. Word is he might be laying off the liquor for a little while.
Oh, really? What's that?
Apparently his stomach issues might be flaring up again, getting a bit worse. So definitely send Micky some good vibes. Wish him well. Hope he feels better soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Take care of yourself, Micky. We're thinking of you.
We are. All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.
We'll catch you next time on Sip and Talk.